Hi, everybody. Well, welcome to the launch of our 2021 series, the lecture series that is the bracket to the history questions that we asked in our fall semester. And this, this series called Worldview, Designing Global Supertalls, is intended as a kind of extension of the exhibition that hasn't opened yet officially at the Skyscraper Museum, still closed until this spring when we hope to welcome the public back into the gallery. But the exhibition called Supertall 2020, a year now concluded, will open, we hope, in order to define what were the markers for supertalls by last year. This is a program of exhibitions that we started really back in 2007 when we did our first exhibition on the Burj, as it was called then, Burj Dubai, now Burj Khalifa, as it was just under construction. And we did our first Supertall survey back then. We did our first exhibition called Supertall in 2011, when we looked at every building in the world at that point that we felt that was already completed or was under construction, or we thought was close enough to beginning construction that it would be completed within a 5-year window. That's about how long it takes to build one of these phenomenal buildings. That show had some 38 buildings in it. This one has 59. And there are 59 buildings in the world now, or will soon be finished within a couple of years, that are as tall or taller than the Empire State Building, 380 meters, 1,250 feet. So that was our low bar for defining super tall. In this exhibition, and I'm going to pivot my computer screen around in a moment so that you can see some of the cases with their models of the unfinished exhibition. There's still parts of it that need to come together, which has been difficult in these COVID conditions. The featured buildings in the exhibition are about 9, including some New York buildings, and we'll talk about, one of the featured towers tonight by Jamie von Klemperer. But we will also, in the rest of the lectures in the series, focus on each one of these featured towers that were selected by me as curator because they, I thought, represented not just what was new on the horizon, the skyline of tall buildings globally, but buildings that are exceptionally beautiful in their formal characteristics. And the tower that we featured in the show, because it is also new, is the China Resources Tower that Jamie von Klemperer will talk about tonight, as well as in Seoul, the Lotte World Tower, which was completed back, I think, in 2017, and was featured in a case in our previous show. So I'm going to turn my computer around so you can see a little bit of the gallery and of the show. You see a lot of our spotlights, but some of the models in the cases, and we have very tall 11-foot murals of the towers on the other side of the cases that you can't see. So this lecture series will expand and develop the themes of the exhibition. They will become videos that help to document the design process of these towers that have been featured in the show. So as I just previewed, tonight's talk by Jamie von Klemperer will focus on his designs, and he was the design principal for these 2 super tall towers in Shenzhen and in Seoul, China Resources Tower and Lotte World Tower, as well as just a few slides to bring it back home to New York City to talk a little bit about his design for One Vanderbilt. So Jamie is the design principal, and meaning the principal designer within KPF, leading the team, a team of designers in the the development of 3 supertalls by Skyscraper Museum definition. He will share his screen in just a moment, but as he gets ready to do that, let me just say that Jamie is a good close friend of many years. We've had discussions about Supertall since I think our China Prophecy exhibition, which was in 2009. From that time, he has been a mentor to me in understanding the design development, the business, and the art of these extraordinary towers. And we're really fortunate that Jamie, a few years ago, agreed to be the chairman of the board of the Skyscraper Museum, which has also been a tremendous benefit to us all. And he's helped in many ways, but in no way really greater than in helping to guide me in understanding the buildings and the places in order to understand the kind of urbanism in the way that these buildings plug into an urban environment, the way they expand an urban environment by transportation, by landscape. And so it's those ideas that I discussed with him for all of these years that I asked him to speak about tonight. And I asked all of our lecturers, who are all friends of different lengths of time and people that I've learned a great deal from. I'll introduce each one of them on each particular night, and I really do want to get out of the way now as soon as I can and let Jamie show this extraordinary group of 101 slides that he's going to share with us. But I asked Jamie in particular to talk about kind of getting the job and working with clients in places like Shenzhen, in Seoul, and the many places around the world that KPF has created iconic towers that help to define the skyline of those cities. If you want to know more about that, go to our exhibition where you'll see each one of the buildings profiled. So let me just mention that Jamie has been at KPF for his entire career as an architect. I think it was 1983 or 84 when he joined as a young architect. And he has now risen to the position of president of the firm. So being both the president in terms of organizing the partnership, the world business of KPF, the many far-flung offices that they have around the world, and at the same time, simultaneously being the lead designer on many projects, not just skyscrapers, but many others as well. And he has other sidelines of board membership in the Urban Design Forum, where he shows his civic chops and shares his knowledge. But I hope that we appreciate him even more than all of those other places where he serves. So Jamie, will you please come on? And I'm going to turn my video off, and I can mute myself as well. And then you'll share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you most of all for organizing this series and for keeping the Skyscraper Museum going in a hard time. Actually, you are there in the space. While the public doesn't course through the doors of the museum as you might like, the ideas are still moving through this series of organized discussions. And so thank you so much. Thank all the board members who are on tonight and many others who are sort of loyal to this special place, which after all promotes the idea of urban density and the knowledge of the history and the current practice of the tall building. So thank you, Carol. So you should all now see a title slide. And the 2 towers, as Carol said, are in Asia, one in Korea, one in Shenzhen. I'll start with the Korean project of the Lotte Tower because it was earlier on in our work. But there's something here in the title about the idea of organic form and or versus more geometric form that comes from science and is more, perhaps a little more rigid. But these have to do not really with ideals that come only from pure design. They have to do with the correspondence of these designs to the companies, to the clients who serve them and whose homes these buildings are. So nobody puts up a 400, 500, 600 meter tower without wanting to do something substantial to change history, and it's often the history of their own endeavors. So looking at the two sections of the buildings with Lotte on the left, the taller of the two at 555 meters, and China Resources, although designed at 500, about halfway through schematic design, was lowered to 400 because of the flight path from the airport, which couldn't be violated. But you see something here that is of a similarity, and that has to do with the tapering of the buildings. This has a lot to do with the program you'll see in a minute, but it also has to do with some idea of the infinite, of perfection, of rising to a point in the sky. The plans of the buildings, which you see here with Lotte on the left and China Resources on the right, one an absolute circle, China Resources, and the Lotte building is a kind of proto-circle. It has its own axial deformation, which I'll explain has to do with the center of Seoul. But there is this idea of achieving a kind of perfection that comes with a very, very tall building. And it's neat in a way to create a symbol which transcends the moment of its immediate circumstances. So I invoke here this wonderful tourist drone shot of Borobudur, the 9th century stepped Buddhist temple in central Java. You may think this comes out of left field. Why would anybody look at a stone stepped monument and talk about steel and concrete 500-meter structures? But we can see there is here, first of all, a kind of origin story. And after all, we'll be talking in this series about how buildings came about. But also there is a search for some kind of perfection. In this case, the sort of some ideal of the Buddhist narrative of achieving a selflessness at the top of a journey of life, but going from a rectangle, or in this case, a square, to a circle. So it serves us well to provide a kind of model. The importance of circles in large buildings, and for its time, a large building, the Pantheon in Rome, changes over time. In the case of the building which Hadrian was finished under Hadrian's imperial reign, a building about the gods, the pantheism of the Roman religious point of view and view of the world, the power of the circle to invoke something eternal. Moving ahead to Francesco di Giorgio and this view of Urbino, no longer a Roman religious symbol, but the circle and the circular building is here. Some idea represents an idea about humanism, about the Renaissance, about proportion, and about man's place in the universe. And then moving to the Enlightenment, to Boulet's great cenotaph for Newton, this spherical structure never built, but gave us a way of imagining what the perfection of spherical and circular geometry could do to make us think about Newton's laws, the laws of the universe. In fact, it is sort of the globe or the universe in the body of the building. And then coming almost to the present day, comparatively speaking, about 100 years ago, a little bit less, Raymond Hood's Radiator building, which not only transforms itself as one can see it on Bryant Park from a square at the base to a point at the top, and with the kind of eroded, chiseled maneuvers becoming an almost circular form at the top. It is, if you will, on fire, the way a radiator building might want to be. It communicates an idea about heat with the gold leaf and gold paint that occur at the top of the finials of the building. So the tower here, coming to the point where it is no longer bound by New York's grid, becomes a radiating form. So I want to go right away to Seoul to talk about the beginning of this Lotte Tower. And as Carol said, I want to tell some fairly casual stories about how the project came to be as it emerged from our drawing boards and then went into the ground. Seoul, as many of you know, is a city of amazing topography, of mountains, valleys, peaks, and ridges. Hard to find any flat area except right by the Han River. And so almost necessarily, as it grew beyond the historical confines of the old imperial city bound by Namdaemun, Dongdaemun, Gyeongbok, etc., in the modern day, it becomes a series of multi-nodes of separate pieces of city that in a way are awaiting definition. And how does one mark the centers of areas such as Yongsan and Jamshil, et cetera? So in this case, the site which we're given, which Lotte had purchased maybe 15 years before we got to the project, marked in red, is to the south of the Han River and south of what you see there in dark gray with a yellow accent, the older Yi dynasty, and before that, Goguryeo, Shilla, et cetera, dynasty, Seoul. So we'll keep that in mind because this orientation is very important to the project, design of the project. But nothing was really more important to the project than the founder of this chaebol, the founder of Lotte, Shin Kyuk-ho, a man who spent, and he left us and died maybe 2 or 3 years ago at the age of about 98. Shin Kyuk-ho had lived about half of his life in Japan, where he got his start in business, and half of his life in Korea. And perhaps because of that, his strong devotion to the idea of the Korean nation, the importance of showing that loyalty, became a big part of his drive to have this tower built, to serve the company, but also to serve the nation. But we see the axis tying back to Seoul. And at a certain point, okay, I'll go back to this image here, you see 3 generations of the studies that went into the hopper for Lotte. They asked initially an architect to make a Eiffel Tower 3 times the scale of Gustav Eiffel's structure. And that lasted a few years. Then they held a competition which we participated in. It was won by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and they produced an interesting building, which you see in the middle, design, which does in fact go from a square to a circle. And we entered this sort of sweeping spiral of a tower, which is not successful. We produced a nice model and plans and so on, but we thought that was the end of our affiliation with the project. As it happens, and as Lotte moved ahead in their own corporate business and their strategy, they decided not to build that competition entry, even though it was quite well advanced in drawing, and to hold another selection process. And that's one that we prevailed in. But even then, the design of the building was not clearly defined. I mean, we proffered some designs, but nothing was fixed. The search was still ongoing. And in that search, the directionality of the incline of this site towards the old Namsan, the old center of Seoul in the mountain, was of prime importance. And so we offered a scheme, which you could see on the right-hand side with a raked angle. My colleague and partner Trent Tesh came up with this interesting idea, very compelling, which had some kind of recall of the great Shilla dynasty temple, a hillside compound temple of Bulguksa. You could see the stepping of the mountain and the stepping of temples. And we made this a kind of modern high-rise version, which opened the section of the building to view and faced almost like an Easter Island artifact or monument, the center of Seoul. However, in the discussions which went through the first 4 or 5 months of work, we were halted in the work when the chairman at some point had an epiphany that this reminded him, having spent a good part of his life in Japan, of a legend of the samurai warrior who came once a year into the village and sharpening his blade would lop somebody in half. And that was unacceptable association. And so we had to start over again. And how did we? We thought about and asked and talked with our client about some essence of Korean culture. And it came to everybody's discussions of the subject that Korean art was full of very subtle curves. And we see the curve of the Korean calligraphy brush. If we look at the result of the brush, we'd see more subtle curves. And then also in the great tradition of celadon, of ceramics, which we can see in the Palace Museum, also these very refined, not pure, not circles and spheres, but ellipses and hyperboloid kind of segments that could make a form that had almost a human softness to it. And so this you can see in the diagram gave us a kind of subject to study where we morphed the true cone or the true arc into something that had a more particular geometry and not of a circular plan, but of a softened square. And that axis, which I showed aimed towards the center of Seoul, could then find definition. I remember sketching this on an airplane with Jean Kohn flying from Hong Kong somewhere else and talking about the way a tower of this sort could be axial. And indeed it is. It has this sort of cleft form. The program of the building, which you can start to see the variegation in colors, retail below, moving up to office, then residential, then hotel, and then entertainment and observation at the top, is a lot more varied than this actually, and about as varied as a tall building gets. It is really a vertical city. And that's not even to speak of the couple million or so of square feet at the base of the building, which we also designed. But in that tower are medical services. You see the little cross in the green. There are conference centers. It's really a kind of a stacked series of gathering spaces. We see here in section with the quite massive core indicated in a lighter color in the middle, and the elevatoring system, which has a series of sky lobbies and shuttle elevators. The only way that this could fit, there are actually 55 elevators in this building, and even then leaving enough room for good uses around it, but through a very, very clever system of elevator engineering. The scale and the scope of spaces in the building we could compare to the linear ground trajectory of a walk through London along Regent Street, and the same scale of spaces and places and buildings. So we try to think of this always as an urban building, even inside its exterior wall. And then the spaces that are carved out to allow not just leased space or owned apartment, but where people could gather in a more public way are shown here in these little scallops that are taken out of the building figuratively, almost as if the building were a candlestick, and you could see this profile. So when we come to the ground of the floor of the building, we could see this way of creating a lobby, indicating a height much more than the 3 stories that actually takes, with a scallop projecting to the outside the notion of a 6 or 7 story scale. The structure of the building, which was masterminded and designed by Saltine C. and Les Robertson and their firm, was of a mega column, 8-column structure, which many of you know from some of the great contemporary Supertall buildings, at the top of which is a sort of a lantern structure truss, which helps to stabilize the building. There are these belt trusses in between and outrigger trusses. So all of this allowing for the stiffness of the building and allowing it to fall within the right means of oscillation and the right periods of movement. Saltine and Les can speak much more meaningfully about this, but we work very closely with them. And what we have in the building, therefore, and you see a belt truss floor, but on a typical floor would be a column-free span along the facade of over 30 meters, about 100 feet. So not only with these mega columns, a great robustness of structure at the time, not long after the tragedies of September 11th, so the need to reassure, but also an openness of use within the building, which is office in that lower portion. We see the mat foundation, which at 6.5 meters thick, I believe the Burj Khalifa's mat somewhere around 3.5. So to pour this concrete, to make the mat, took, it was a continuous pour. There were over 5,200 concrete trucks lined up through the city of Seoul, stopping traffic over, I believe, 2.5, 3 days to make this possible. You see the sort of a tremmy-like insect leg red devices that pour the concrete where it's needed. And there, the tower as it's finished. And now let's look a little bit more closely at some of the details. The curtain wall of the consists of a series, you see these fins, vertical fins, to accentuate the verticality of the building, also provides some shading, but they telescope as the building moves up from that 600 mm depth down all the way to a 250 mm. So there is a kind of organic order of mimicking, let's say, the strands of fiber in a celery stalk, something that starts organically large and tapers to a very small dimension, even at the detail. Here you see movers where the mechanical systems are distributed. That's before the glass mover system was installed, which you can see hides that very nicely. That was a good trick. The lakeside by which the building is located gives the building a kind of a meaning in terms of its landscape context, and also the buildings next to it, which we'll talk about in just a minute, part of the project. So base and tower and urban order and sky volume or sky scale are conceived of at the same time. So I'm just going to move on here, although my screen got a little fixed. So I just wanted to mention then about the base of the building, a little bit like the root ball or root zone of a tree, perhaps the most important part of a tree for its vitality, and the roots or the base of this building, no different in a way, looking at an early sketch. All of the different functions and uses and neighborhood amenities in this district of Jamshil then defined a lot of what went into the program and how we would open up the site in a permeable way to use by the general population. And the circle, which is not fully realized in the tower, is more closely realized in this semicircular space, a kind of Piazza of Siena, if you will, with a 555-meter tower off to the side, cupping space, allowing landscape in, and giving us a public arena. The elements of the base, the masses of this base, which in conceptual form show the spherical, circular elements you see here in the finished product, with a variety of textural uses of metal and masonry to dapple and delight with a relief from the scale of what are some really quite large buildings. You see in the section here how much activity goes into this, at the top of which, at the top of the podium, is, you might be able to see there, and you'll see in a minute in the interior view, a public concert hall. And here's the exterior of that concert hall, positioned 10 floors in the air. Here, the interior, where the Seoul Symphony Orchestra has its venue. And so public and private and civic and high-rise come together. Here, the entry plaza. The spaces which I mentioned are scooped out of the side of the building, here shown as the main lobby, and this sort of radial and double curved wood-clad ceiling of the lobby with this little cusp of a trim below it. Then at the top of the building, very important to its aspirations to become the pinnacle of the country, is a 3-4 story sequence of entertainment, observation deck, public visiting touristic functions. You see a glass floor to a bridge, which is supposed to be sort of a thrill. And then the geometries of the top, where you see some of the diagonals of structure, which Les saw brought to make a sort of a hat truss, but calmly, in a way, calmed down and shrouded by the continued white of the verticals. And here, from some points of view, on a misty day, from a surrounding mountaintop with a good telephoto lens, you could see the tower rise above the environment, rise above the mists in the cloud. So let's move on to our second subject today, and think not so much about the natural forms that inspired client to embrace the design that we brought to the project, and not the consumer company that Lotte is, of a sort of soft, things you can eat and touch, but rather China resources. So this company is in a way unparalleled in its importance to China. You see it here on the Bay of Hohai in Shenzhen, in an area that's been designated by the government as a center for corporations. So the China Resources Company began well before the nation of China, the modern nation, came to be in 1949. In fact, the origin story of this company precedes even Mao's Long March. In 1931, a couple of gentlemen and their cohorts brought 2 gold blocks or bricks through what must have been war-torn China, the period of civil war, to Hong Kong, deposited them in a bank. And so the company, which is now the kind of inheritor company, is in a way at the origin of the financial security of what we know today to be the great nation of China. So this was part of the aspiration and maybe the burden of the project. You can see here several circles showing how Shenzhen has grown as a line segment from right towards the left, and the solid dot being this area of Hohai, which was more or less being shaped as we did the project. And we were to be the sort of fulcrum and pivot point of that part of Shenzhen. So the first ideas which came to mind and to the pen were not circles. In fact, we were really asked not to do a tower so much as a collection of buildings that reminded us more of the program of Rockefeller Center and the urbanism of the sort of spaces that can be so linked to the rectilinear form that, as with Rockefeller Center, they naturally evolve from building form to experience. But this didn't last too long, partly because of our dialogue with the client, but also there's a lot of work with the city planners of Hohai and of Shenzhen. And you see the way the site sits next to a grid, which is then a new part of Shenzhen, but also the bay, the water. And the building was meant to be, and its site meant to be a sort of mediator between water and land. And the profile of the building was meant to pierce the skyline of what was then Hohai and give us a focal point. In the early stages of the competition, and just about the point where we were awarded the job, we offered these 3 ideas, very different in their diamond, square, and what we had built, which is the circular cone, if you will. And all of them appreciated. What was important was the simplicity and the purity of each of the schemes. So here is my early sketch for that scheme that was embraced and accepted. And there was a symbolism which came to the project really as we were designing. I can't say it came out of our heads, and then was presented to the client. It was sort of a bit of banter that went back and forth. And here you see from the sketch, we made a model showing these strands of verticals with a structure that became a basket weave of diagonals at base and top. But that narrative had a lot to do, even though this geometry was in a sense absolute, there was still a link to an idea of nature. Next to the site is a large athletics complex, a big stadium where Asia Games, I believe, and University Games were held. owned and built by China Resources. China Resources is a company that makes many, many things: coal mines, real estate, big retail centers, manufacture, all sorts of, and banking. And so, yes, they had an athletic center, and that was known as the Cocoon because it had this sort of interesting diagrid roof, sort of like a web spun. And it came to mind, presented this cone-like scheme that the building somehow could be seen as a bamboo shoot. And it was just at the time of the Spring Festival and the rebirth of the world after the winter. And so this bamboo shoot is actually symbolically and metaphorically just the right thing to invoke at that time. And the chairman embraced it. And that became then the solution for the site. The other buildings on the site didn't go away. We continued to master plan and show how this could make a complex and how the building, this pivot fulcrum, could link to an axis diagonal of green just to the bottom or south of that dot, or over to the right to Hohai, so that pedestrians could come and back and forth to the water, to a sort of riverside park. And next to the big circle of the tower was a smaller circle of a museum to the history of this corporation, which I was just describing a little bit of to you before. Very important, the sense of heritage. So the section and the elevation here, the structural engineer for this project was Arab, and David Scott in particular. And it's a very interesting structure because although it does have a central core of concrete, the outside of the building, the second layer of structure that works in tandem with the core is all steel, very unusual for China. And elements of steel that were prefabricated in sort of hash mark-like elements, a little bit like the old World Trade Center. And you see the elevating system on the right-hand side being a combination of conventional with shuttle elevators and some double-decker elevatoring as well, all to make this, quite a usable building. The structure here, you can see there's zones for most of the run of the vertical height of the tower that are straight columns. They're actually so small that they really read as mullions, and they're outside the floor plan of the building. They're outside the spandrel beams, so that when the curtain wall was complete and then you drew the blinds or the scrim, the shades, you couldn't see a column, a little bit like the old Chase Manhattan building downtown in New York. And then at the base and the top, you can see here the use of this diagrid. So various elements of structure coming together with curtain wall gave us a great sort of lexicon of elements to design to make this building in its clean geometries work out. It's the sort of building, once the geometries were set, in a way, the building designed itself. I don't really mean that literally, but all of our designers working on the project, Richard Nemeth and Brian Chung and others, they could follow the path of logic to realize this building, and working with Les and Satine made that come to life in other dimensions. A little sort of vignette of a piece of the building where the diagonal of structure influences the feeling of a protection that the canopy, entry canopy affords, and the sort of splaying out chevrons and folded diagonals is shown in this model. And we see here a simple section of the building. One beautiful thing about it is that the ground floor, you'll see later, has no encumbrances at all. No truck dock, no fire command box, nothing but space going around in a circle, because those functions are taken care of elsewhere below and above. The sequence of plans, yes, they are all circular. The core diminishes, of course, as we go up. It's a cross plan, not unusual for a super tall building, especially in the Chinese context. And you see some of the sample plans here. And these, I don't remember how many, maybe 38 columns, which again, they're outside the spandrel. So they're in a way exoskeletal. And from the inside, there's nothing at all but core. There is a zone 10 stories high, about 2/3 the way up the building, where China Resources wanted their own internal atrium So slabs were cut out, a spiral staircase was provided, a kind of interesting moment in the building. And then I mentioned this sort of perfection of geometry. Well, the designs really look kaleidoscopic. And of course, we experimented and tried back and forth with structure to understand how these lines could converge at the top without creating a solid. You take, 35 columns and pull them to a point, and you'll have a solid block of steel, and that wasn't the case. The thinning of the building happens, and the thinning of its elements as we come to the culmination at the top. So you can see that here pretty well shown in this wooden model at the top, which sits in our office in Hong Kong and has its own beauty of these little pleats of diagonal windows. And we can see here, the core, the major core stops short of the top of the building. Not too many high-rise buildings feature this kind of ability not to have the top of the building dominated by elevator overruns, machine rooms, ventilation machines, et cetera, et cetera. That's taken care of elsewhere. And so we lead ourselves to the top of the building. You'll see later on to a free and open cathedral-like space. Here you can see the structure clearly going up, not just a concrete core, but some of the prefabricated column and tab, column and beam elements, 3 floors at a time, fabricated at the base of the building shop, and then hoisted up. Speed was a very, very big determinant of the scheme. And you could see here at the base, not the diagonal movement of the steel columns, but also the wiggling back and forth of the spandrel beam at the base to allow the pleats of glass, which you'll see in a moment, to occur. I talked earlier about the canopy, which has its own kind of interesting and lively structure. Each of the column mullions, so to speak, this is fit over the steel, is an assemblage of stainless steel cladding on top of steel and aluminum structure, these jackets, of which there are, I believe, 10 different sizes as you move up the building, a little bit like the telescoping mullions of Lotte. And at the top, this little cone or cap, which must be 30 foot tall, and is this little piece of a pointed finial or termination of the tower, looking from the top. And a shot that I took during construction towards the end, I like almost more than the finished product, because it reminds me of the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, because of the finesse of the, not our work so much as this scaffolding that the workers were using to get up and build the thing. And it is almost like some French high Gothic piece of gingerbread. There, the tower in reflected on the lake, or the bay rather, of Hohai of the East China Sea. And some of the elements which we designed around it, this market hall, which takes a little bit of inspiration from the formal maneuvers of the tower, but is a kind of a little bit of, let's say, a faneuil hall for the urban square and park that fronts the tower. The other view of the tower coming from the park, that linear axis that goes through that part of Shenzhen, the building almost as if we're just sitting on green with nothing more than a light touch coming down to the points or the columns, or this almost surreal view of almost a prairie of wild growth sitting below the 400-meter steel structure. On the other side, the drop-off road with the folding canopy, and you see those elements of glass coming in and out according to those spandrel beam definitions. The building is entered on the sort of Civic Plaza side over a bridge. A lot of the planning of the base of the building has to do with the double-decker elevators and the need to have 2 floors activated at a time for arrival, for departure to go up into the building and on those sky lobby floors as well. A really interesting challenge was actually to marry the square core with a circular perimeter of the building, in the ceiling and the floor, the lobby, the floor, we just made, a nice neutral granite. But the ceiling, we wanted to create a kind of origami-like device of some sort of negotiation between these two forms. And so it becomes a piece of sculpture. The very top of the building, I mentioned, is actually a space inside. It is not a piece of machinery or mechanical convenience. And so here we are, you see the figures giving you scale. I don't actually remember the height of this. It probably is around 25 meters, so about 75 foot tall. And so this becomes the great gathering place for the corporation, or when the city has something really important to celebrate, the mayor, the citizens of Shenzhen, this is the place. And it's a sort of, in a way, the way we think of the top of Rockefeller Center, the top of the great tall buildings of New York. But it has this kind of uncompromising openness and 360-degree clarity. Looking up then at the reflected ceiling plan, or the dome of the building with a great light fixture making the top, and all of these strands of support and of cleaning access and of ventilation cams and louvers. And it's a multifunctional piece of fairly major construction. So before we finish, if I can, I want to show you a 1-minute video taken by the client and one of their drones, showing us what it's like to look at the top of the building from on high. And we see that little beanie cap that we saw on the ground now is installed. We see the pleating of the glass, the shining of the stainless steel, a little opening for maintenance rigs, and at the very top, a little bit of telecoms buds, which kind of come into view as we zoom down towards, as that drone kind of sets itself down, almost like a moon landing on the top of this rocket ship. I want to finish though, and we've sort of, thank you for your patience listening to these stories, the origin stories of these two great buildings of Lotte and China Resources. And I wanted to finish with 3 or 4 images of something that's closer to home, but I would say for which we learned a lot at KPF in our design and our conception of the Vanderbilt Tower. As you may know, the tower is almost complete. The ground, or rather not groundbreaking, but ribbon cutting, and the opening of the building's been celebrated. The hoist is still up. And my colleagues and Nick Dunn, Andrew Clary is still going to site, and Jean Kohn, who worked with us on the project, watching from a distance. But the reason I bring it up is that the tower is at the same time a tower of clean and pure geometries. It's also an organic form of a spiral, of an offset pinwheel. You can liken it, as we did, to the petals of a rose, which kind of unfurl and unfold in a way as we see the organic form of a bird of paradise or a rose or some other plant. And on the right-hand side, we see the major 1, 2, 3, 4 volumes that are collaged together to make a tapered building, and to give this building its due, to mark what we interpreted as the center of Manhattan. Well, Manhattan doesn't have a center the way Washington, D.C., or it doesn't have a mythological center the way Rome does, but 42nd Street and Madison and Park Avenue come about as close as we can, and the connection to Grand Central Terminal makes that even more sort of powerful. And so the spiral of this building is really about, as Bill Pedersen wrote to me once in a very, I thought, prescient note, that the building expresses centrality in its asymmetry the way a symmetrical structure could not. And so this was an early sketch which I did as if looking from Bryant Park, and it doesn't look so different today from Bryant Park, our office. It looks out onto this space. But you see this cascading at the top and the lightening up of the structure and the taper and the coming to a point, which in a way is that same kind of instinct as we saw in Lotte and in China resources, and the celebration of the apex with a kind of lacework of something very delicate that could just think of the infinite. Still under construction in this photograph, we can see the hoist there, and we can see the kind of lacework of zigzags at the top of the building where, like the other two buildings I showed, and like some of the great tall buildings, which you'll see in the later lectures and talks that'll be given by my colleagues in the field here at the Skyscraper Museum program, the deck, the observation deck, is really a building type, subtype unto itself, and it's a very, very important part of the Vanderbilt Tower. This building had to adhere to the Manhattan grid. The grid is the theme and the kind of skeleton and the grain and the raison d'etre of New York is grid. And so this building, in a way, makes a point tower and makes something that is very centrally driven, but from elements of the right angle, through the taper and through the back and forth. So I'll end with this image, maybe a few minutes early, mercifully, because it's getting to be evening and we're probably all zoomed out. But I want you to appreciate really here what beyond the architecture, the city planners of New York, Amanda Burton in this case was really the godmother of the building, the client Mark Holliday and S.L. Green, not just to give the sort of polite hats off, but to show that there was a civic pride that went into the making of this building that went so far beyond its commercial obligations, so far beyond what one needed to make a buck or $1 million or $1 billion. It's the idea of something that should stand, as I think Hope came through in my discussion of the other projects, as a sort of commitment to a belief, not a religious belief, not a narrative belief, but in something of the greatness of urbanism, the greatness of structure, and the greatness of the builders and those who put together, even the thousands of craftsmen and women who put together these buildings. Thank you for listening. I hope there'll be some questions. I think, Carol, you're going to come on to take the floor, I believe.
And thank you for a fabulous presentation. I knew it would be, but we really got to revel in the images full screen, and everything was absolutely stunning and beautifully explained. I will take the last few minutes. I mean, we have maybe 5 to 8 minutes for a little bit of discussion, and there have been a few questions posed, but one that I'll ask that is going to, I'm sure, occur in every single one of these programs, and it has to do with the present moment. You brought us back to home. Thank you very much to New York. I mean, these are all buildings that for which you are the principal designer, and you can explain the whole story of their genesis and the particulars of their design. As I mentioned at the beginning, for those who didn't come in at the very beginning of the session, this idea of worldview was really to transport us a bit in our present shrunken moment as we all live on screens and as we're all constrained in travel. Jamie is someone who spends a good deal of his life in the air, going from one continent to the next. You'll hear from him in the middle of the night, and it's the morning where he is in any one of those travels. So he spends so much of his time going around the world, speaking with clients, understanding different cities. And in bringing the talk, but also kind of the prize of New York's renewed preeminence in super tall construction, what is extraordinary kind of emerged from this exhibition. With the last round of about 10 or 12 years of construction, New York, once again, is the world's leading city in the number of super tall buildings. And that's because principally we've added about four of residential, the super slender residential towers, but also really quite astonishing office towers, which have begun to now poke above the datum. Someone asked the question, why 380 meters tall? Why 1,250 feet for the Skyscraper Museum's definition of super tall? And that's because of the Empire State Building. That is the height of the Empire State Building. There's no good reason why the round number of 300 meters or about 1,000 feet should be the definition of super tall, which is the one which is more generally accepted. But we thought that that's a 19th century definition. That's the Eiffel Tower, the 300-meter tower. The 380-meter tower is the 20th century definition, the Empire State Building. And so if we take all the buildings above that height, you narrow the category to only about 59 buildings rather than I think 270 buildings of 300 meters or taller. So you really are talking about a more rarefied type by using the Empire State Building as the benchmark. So I answered that question from the chat. But let me just remind people again that New York and the US was the home to the world's tallest buildings, super talls, if you will, through the 20th century. And they were buildings of steel, they were office buildings, and they were in North America. And then by about 1998, and we'll talk about Jinmao, we'll talk about Petronas Towers and the rest of the lecture, the title went to Asia, and it went then to the Middle East. And if you talk about the 21st century super tall, it's a building that's usually a mixed use structure, as Jamie showed with Lotte World Tower. And it's built probably of concrete, and it's not in North America. But lo and behold, within the last few years, New York has reasserted itself for being the home not just to the Empire State Building as the single surviving super tall from the 20th century, but rather another 6 towers in order to have more than anywhere else in the world. But my question, Jamie, that I want to go back to, throw it back to you, is to say, is to talk a little bit about the global dimension, both of your practice and also the future of the super tall, because it's clear that commissions outside of the US are the place where the most buildings are going to be built. And connect that, please, to this question of the present moment in the pandemic, where everybody here in New York is asking the question, will people go back to office buildings? Will we build tall buildings? Will anyone want to ride in an elevator? And those concerns of the moment. And tell us from your perspective of the moment, how China and South Korea and the Middle East and other places, which have fared much better in their response to the pandemic in terms of their economy and also their mortality rates. And tell us about what's happening there now. Is there a change in the centralizing of single city within a city buildings?
Yeah, strangely not for the most part. Obviously, there's a more nuanced answer because, to answer your question, we'd all have to think about hundreds and hundreds of situations in different cities in China. But I would say we, as a KPF, are working on more very tall buildings, now capped after Xi Jinping's pronouncement of a few years ago to 498, 500 meters, nothing above that limit. Those are still very, very tall buildings. And the number which we and our colleagues in the field are taking on, newly commissioned in many cases, since the pandemic, have not slowed down. And so, that has to do with a lot of issues of urbanization, which continue. We know the rate of urbanization of China in the last 20, 25 years has been phenomenal. It's not stopping for what we can see. As you say, the growth rate of the economy compared to what we're going through now in Europe and the US is robust. But still also the faith in the importance of making modern structures and modern buildings of mixed use that can bring people together. It's a model that I think about which there's a lot of faith in China. So, the simple answer is we have as many architects on the boards, making models, thinking about these tall buildings, I would say, as we had in the past. I think the other part of your question, if it's probably multi-parts, but the other big part is about the pandemic. In our context here in New York, what about our social habits, our planning, our development, our city planning? And of course, we have hit, very few, what are there now? Between 5 and 10% of Class A offices are occupied by population in New York. And so we can't say that we've turned any corner. And even with the light provided by the hope of vaccines, still nothing's really moving in urban habits. But those real estate developers, foreign and local, who have occasion to think tall, are going right ahead with their plans. And some of these I can't divulge because they're non-disclosure agreements we have to be careful about. But these are buildings well over 1,000 foot tall. And I would say the financiers and the developers are thinking with their pocketbooks as well as their brains. And it's not a open season for dozens of tall buildings, but a surprising number of tall buildings are going ahead. And I think, of course, there's issues of public health that we can all read the newspaper, so we all have opinions, but none of us expected to be solved within a few months, but none of us really expected to go beyond a few years. I mean, anything could happen, with new viruses, et cetera. But I think for our purposes, talking about the art and the craft and the business and the engineering of tall buildings and urban concentration, I don't think that we're going anywhere but back to an appreciation for the excitement and the productivity and the sort of creative synergies of being together in dense urban spaces. So are there realizations about the healthy building? Yes. About open space at the ground? Yes. Those things were perhaps on their way to being tackled and improved anyway. I would hope so. But they've been given a real lift by this COVID period. So we can use this now as a time to innovate. Of course, the environmental issues having to do with these buildings. I forgot to mention, my colleague Richard Nemeth reminded me that in the Lotte Tower, there were over 1.5 kilometers of underground pipeworks for geothermal energy. So, that was an interesting example, but today there's a lot more impetus to make any building stand up to the challenge of climate change. And I think we will see that happening. So I see ahead a period of great creativity in the tall building. Your museum, our museum, will have a lot of great exhibits of stuff that hasn't been dreamt of today in 5-10 years. And it's a future of meaning and purpose.
Well, we're past our time, and that seems like a very hopeful note to end on. As always, Jamie, I never have enough time to talk to you. There's always so many more questions that we could explore, and this was really a fabulous introduction to the series. So we'll look forward to bringing you back in some of these discussions, and maybe when we can all get together, multiple speakers, in order to have a kind of final roundup. And you've certainly launched us onto an aspirational trajectory for the rest of the course.
Thanks. Looking forward to some wonderful talks.
Thank
you.
Thanks, everybody. See you. Oh, next Tuesday, when Scott Duncan of SOM, who's very close to my heart because his very first commission and working for SOM straight out of architecture school was to be the project architect executing the Skyscraper Museum. And next week he will discuss Guiyang Tower that he designed, which is in the exhibition featured. So not only did he design the cases in the exhibition, he designed find one of the towers inside of the cases. So we will join us next week for the continuing travelogue of Chinese cities and of brand new skyline images in those places. So thanks, everybody. See you next week.